So, Coaster 2103 project. Rail preservation is a combination of deliberate efforts, hard-fought battles, and sometimes just really fortunate circumstances. I think many of the people in this room who have been in this position before can vouch for that. Common questions and criticisms that I see from the larger rail fan community, they usually boil down to a couple things. They either ask questions like, why don't they just blank? Or they should just blank. And after going through this experience, what I really want to tell those people is stop right there. Think about that question a little bit. The people in charge of this effort have probably already been down that road. We'll see a lot of that tonight. Organizations have to make compromises and tough decisions when it comes to rail preservation. You can't save every piece of equipment. Sometimes you have to give up one piece of equipment in order to get another. Sometimes a piece of equipment you have is deteriorating to the point where it just can't be saved, and all you can do is get rid of it. These decisions are driven primarily by economics, statistics. Oftentimes the organization's mission statement comes in the factor, and sometimes it just comes down to the personal whims and preferences of those who are in charge at the time. So let's talk a little bit about the history of North County Transit District and Coaster as a service. California Senate Bill 802 in 1975 established the North San Diego County Transit Development Board, NSDCTDB. I'm not going to try to read that off every time. I'll just call it the board. But it was established to plan, construct, and operate public transit in North San Diego. They started by acquiring existing bus systems in Escondido and Oceanside. They continued to plan and build out that system over the next 20 years. They also began planning for the Coast Express Rail service in 1982. That name would ultimately be shortened to Coaster, as we all know it today. The system was planned from the beginning to have 8 stations and would run for 41 route miles from Oceanside Transit Center down to Santa Fe Depot in downtown San Diego. Early in the 1990s, the board would order 5 F40 PHM-2C locomotives from Morrison Knudsen. They would also order 16 bi-level coaches and cab cars from Bombardier. The F40 PHM-2Cs were manufactured in Boise, Idaho. They were similar to the earlier EMD F40PH locomotive, but with several key differences, which I'll get to in a slide or two here. 1994 was a big year in the development of Coaster. The board formed the San Diego Northern Railway, SDNR, and the purpose of that was to maintain, enhance, and operate the Coaster service. So essentially, it would be the railroad operating entity of NC, that whole acronym right there. The Association of American Railroading assigned SDNR the reporting marks of SDNX. Now, the board and the San Diego Metropolitan Transit Development Board, as it was called at the time, purchased the San Diego County portion of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway's Los Angeles Division 4th District that year. The way it broke down was what would become NCTD would purchase from Orange County line all the way through the city of Del Mar to the northern city limit of San Diego. MTDB, which we now know as MTS, would purchase from that point down to Santa Fe Depot in downtown San Diego. The board would take delivery of the locomotives and bi-level cars later in 1994. And then on February 25th, 1995, coaster service was inaugurated. It started with a modest weekday-only schedule, particularly in the peak flow direction. So most of the service was southbound in the morning, most of the service was northbound in the afternoon. They started out running fairly short trains, usually 3 cars. That number would increase over time to 4-car trains and eventually 5-car trains, which became the standard for many years. Here's just a few early photos of coaster in operation. Kind of a rare back-to-back locomotive consist there. Normally the trains would run with just 1 locomotive. You have a locomotive, anywhere from 2 to 4 coaches, and then a cab car on the south end of the train set. I think that picture on the right there was taken on Miramar Hill. By the way, the majority of the photos in this presentation are either photos that came from our collection or they're photos that I personally took. Service expanded as demand grew, so they started adding cars to trains. They started increasing the number of weekday trains. Obviously, with the increase in service, they needed more equipment. So in 1997, they purchased 6 additional bi-level coaches. In 2002, they took delivery of 2 additional locomotives. Those were EMD F59 PHI locomotives, similar to what was pulling the Amtrak Surfliner trains for the first 18 years of its existence. And finally, they took a delivery of additional 6 cars in 2003. I think that was 4 coaches and 2 more cab cars. So that rounded out the fleet that existed from that point until 2021. In 2005, the California State Legislature renamed the North San Diego County Transit Development Board to the North County Transit District. And that was probably to reflect the fact that the board had done its job of developing a transit system. Now it was primarily tasked with maintaining and operating that system. In the mid-2000s, NCTD sent the 5 F40 locomotives out to the Norfolk Southern Juniata locomotive shops. And that would serve as a midlife rebuild for the locomotives. Actually fairly early on in their life cycles. I think the first one went out in 2004, 2005. So they were only about 10 or 11 years old when they got sent out for those rebuilds. Part of what happened during those rebuilds is they got some upgraded electronics, they got engine rebuilds, lots of body work, because as you'll see in some of the later photos here, operating trains next to the Pacific Ocean full-time takes a pretty heavy toll on the equipment. Lots of saltwater corrosion, lots of rust. I don't know if there's any great pictures in the presentation here, but it was actually pretty easy to see on the equipment which side was always facing the ocean. It was always the west side of the equipment that had more rust damage than the east side of the equipment. In the mid-2000s, NCTD officially dissolved the San Diego Northern Railroad, and they eventually would change the reporting marks internally on their equipment to NCTC for North County Transit Coaster. They never actually changed those reporting marks in the AAR system, as we would learn fairly late in the process when we were getting ready to move them. They also increased their service. They added Saturday service and eventually added Sunday service. So let's talk a little bit about the locomotive specifications. These locomotives were built with a combination of new and remanufactured parts. The prime mover, which is the industry term for the main engine on a diesel locomotive that provides traction power, was an EMD 16-cylinder 645 engine. So each cylinder has 645 cubic inches of displacement. Very common engine that was in use pretty much from the 60s up through the 90s. These were sort of the tail end of 645 engine production EMD was transitioning at the time to the 710 engine, which was their latest two-stroke engine offering. Now, the big differentiator between these locomotives and the earlier Amtrak F40 locomotives was that these had their own separate engine for providing head-end power to the passenger cars. Head-end power is a 480 volt AC 60 hertz system. Provides all the power for lighting, air conditioning, toilets, PA system, door controls. The cars originally had pneumatic controls. They've since been upgraded to electric controls also. But there's a pretty substantial electrical load on a passenger car. So you need a powerful system to provide that electricity. On the older Amtrak F40s, that power was taken directly off the prime mover, which required that the engine sit there in full throttle, essentially, in the entire time. And the only way that you could apply power to the wheels on those locomotives is to vary the amount of excitation going to the main generator. With this newer solution, you have that separate, much smaller engine running so that your main engine not only doesn't have to run in full throttle the entire time, but it can also deliver its full 3,000 horsepower. You're not stealing any power from that to provide that hotel load to the cars. The Coaster F40s were built with 2,000-gallon fuel tanks. They had a top speed of 103 miles per hour, although they were normally limited to 90 miles per hour in regular service. The dimensions were slightly different from the Amtrak F40s too. I believe they were about 8 to 10 feet longer, and that was just to accommodate that extra length on the rear for that head-end power engine. The total weight of the locomotives is approximately 141 tons each. That's the general equipment arrangement, giving you an overview of all the appliances in there. So you have your cab, got your main engine right here. The main alternator and auxiliary alternator are up above there. You've got your part of your air intake system right there. The dynamic brake fan and cooling grids right there. The auxiliary equipment rack there, which has the oil cooler, the water expansion tank, the oil filter housing, and the fuel filter system. Up above that is 2 fans and the radiators for the main engine. The air compressor is on the rear there. And there's actually a bulkhead inside the engine room. Behind that, you have that Cummins head-end power engine with its separate alternator right in front of it and its separate cooling system there. The only commonality of these two systems is that they pulled from the same fuel tank. So a question I've gotten is, why preserve one of these coaster locomotives? They're not old in the general scheme of things. Yet.
I wasn't old at one time either.
Well, let's think about this for a second. First of all, our mission statement says that we have a particular emphasis on railroads of San Diego County. Well, the coaster service is entirely captive to San Diego County. Who's better to preserve parts of that history than our museum? The F40 PHM-2C locomotives are unique in their own right. There aren't any others in preservation at the moment. Lastly, get them while you can. Sure, they might not be that old right now, but what if we hadn't intervened? You're going to see that if we hadn't intervened, they would have been cut up for scrap. 20 or 30 years down the road, well, why didn't anyone think to preserve one? So that's why we had to act now. So a little about me. I was born in 1995, the same year that the coaster service was inaugurated.
You were already getting Social Security, Bob.
Yeah. I retired a year after that.
I know.
I was, no, 2006, I retired.
We're showing our relative ages here. I've been a lifelong rail fan, and I distinctly remember riding behind those locomotives from a very early age. One of my favorite little day trips to do with my family was we would get on a coaster train in Old Town, ride it up to Solana Beach and go to lunch at Pizza Port. Great restaurant, by the way, it's still there. There's a photo of me in front of a Amtrak San Diegan train at Santa Fe Depot. The date is May 25th, 97, so I was less than 2 years old in this photo.
Oh, what a cute kid.
What the heck happened?
I used to run 237.
Yeah, yeah. I started volunteering with PSRMA in 2010. I started out in the operations department by training to be a speeder operator. Photo was taken in 2011, shortly after I got that qualification. I finished high school in 2013 and finished brakeman training that same year, so I got qualified as a brakeman. Then I went off and disappeared for about 4 years to go to college at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I wasn't completely gone from the museum though. I did come back during my school breaks. I got conductor qualified in 2015. Those are my parents there riding with me on the train shortly after that. I started student locomotive engineer training in 2016. Spent my last year of college while I was back home from breaks, getting that training knocked out. Finished college with a bachelor's of science in civil engineering in 2017. And I got my locomotive engineer qualification soon after that. It was also around that time that I got heavily involved in our equipment department. That's when I started working a lot more with the then equipment director, Ron Hyatt. And I really started getting rolled into more of these higher level museum administrative decisions. It was at the end of 2018, or excuse me, 2017, when they asked me if I would join the board of directors as the secretary. The position had been vacant for a few months at the time. One of the other board members had been acting secretary for several months and really needed to get that off his plate. So they asked me if I would take that position on, and I was stupid enough to say yes. Haven't been able to get off the board since then. Very soon after that, it was actually maybe a month into 2018, NCTD put out a press release saying that they were seeking to replace the F40 locomotives with new Siemens SC44 charger locomotives. Now, their rationale for that was that the F40 locomotives were over 20 years old at that point. They were getting really beat up operating by the ocean there. And it was just becoming uneconomical for them to continue operating them. They were starting to experience a lot of mechanical failures on the locomotives. If you were to go out and watch coaster trains in 2018 through 2021, especially before the pandemic, you saw a lot of trains rolling around with 2 locomotives. One of them was usually providing tractive power to the train. The other was providing electrical power to the cars. They couldn't get one good locomotive to do both. So when they made that announcement, Ron and I had a sit-down discussion. We agreed that it was something we wanted to pursue. We wanted to try to get one of these locomotives. We wanted to get our foot in the door. We were right at the point where they were announcing publicly that they had an intent to get rid of these locomotives. So we figured we need to at least put our name out there so that they know we exist and we know that we're interested. So I agreed to take on the project. At the March 2018 board meeting, the board authorized me to write and send a letter to North County Transit District. We requested 3 things. We requested one of the F40 locomotives once they were retired. We requested 1 or more of the bi-level cars once they were retired. We also requested the old wigwag signal that came off of the Escondido branch. I'll explain a little bit more of that in a couple slides here. This is the actual letter here before it got signed. We sent that in March and we went about 2 months without hearing anything on it. Finally heard back about 2 months later. First thing they told us was something we already knew. The cars are being retained. We have a rebuild program planned for them. No immediate plans to retire them. Check back later. Second bullet point here. We think that the grant we got for the locomotives requires the old F-40s to be scrapped. Last point here. We're a public agency. We have no experience making a donation like this. We don't really understand how to do it. That was the gist of what they said. I have to give some credit to Jim Lundquist here. He was actually the one who pushed me to push back on them. I was about ready to drop it right at that point.
Push until they tell you to go to hell, get away from them.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about this grant. NCTD received a grant through the Carl Moyer Memorial Air Quality Standards Attainment Program, hereinafter referred to as Carl Moyer. That's a program administered by the California Air Resources Board, CARB, and they got that grant to purchase the new SC-44 locomotives. The grant totaled about $10 million. They were planning to get 5 of these new locomotives, so it was paying about $2 million apiece. I couldn't tell you offhand whether that paid for the entire purchase price or if they leveraged some other funds as well, but they definitely needed the money from this grant. No question about that. The Carl Moyer grant is an air quality improvement grant. Simple. They're trying to improve the health of Californians by removing particulate matter, ozone, and other unhealthy materials from the atmosphere. In order to achieve that, they require that the locomotives that are being replaced have to be at least disabled, and quite often the grant terms say they have to be destroyed, physically cut into pieces small enough to fit into a scrap bin, that kind of thing. And as a result of that, the grant recipient, in this case NCTD, would get $10 million for 5 new locomotives. So from a public benefit standpoint, it's a pretty clear win-win, relatively speaking. Brand new locomotives for NCTD to replace their aging, expensive to maintain fleet, and the public gets slightly better air quality. How much of an improvement is 5 locomotives going to make compared to the hundreds of thousands of automobiles in the county every day? You tell me.
Not much.
You said it, not me. Okay, now, we did have an early victory here. NCTD, after a little bit of prodding, agreed to donate this wigwag signal that came off of the Escondido branch. This is a late model magnetic flagman signal. It guarded, I have no idea how to pronounce that. Mahomey Street. It's a street in Vista, California. It survived until 2005. It was actually the last wigwag signal of its type that was operating in San Diego County.
Wow.
It was finally retired in 2005, give or take, as NCTD was upgrading the Escondido branch for the up-and-coming Sprinter, which we all know now is the diesel multiple unit service from Oceanside to Escondido. These are a couple of photos of that wigwag being removed in 2005. And it sat in a warehouse first and then eventually outdoors at their Stewart Mesa facility for over a decade. Why they decided to hold on to this signal, I have no idea. Somebody at the agency might have had the foresight to realize that it was a historic piece and it was worth preserving, but I couldn't tell you. But we knew that it was still sitting around at Stewart Mesa, because if you rode a train by there, you could see it just sitting out there among all the junk that they have at the south end of the yard. So they agreed to donate it to us. So we picked that up in September of 2018. And I believe that was, again, Jim Lundquist there who brought a trailer up there to pick it up and bring it down to Campo. So why is this even noteworthy? It got our foot in the door with NCTD. And I think that's important because it showed that we were actually interested enough to acquire something from them at our own expense, on our own time, and move it to our museum. And it established just enough of a working relationship with them that I had a few people now at that agency that I could go and talk to regularly. So a few more months passed, and eventually I set a few more nagging reminders towards the end of 2018. I reiterated that we were interested in one of the F-40s. Their response was, well, we're still trying to figure out what we really want to do with them, but consider yourself on notice that we know you want one of them. Okay. Quite a bit of time passed. I'm jumping way forward to June of 2019. 2019 was a busy year at our organization. It was the centennial of the San Diego and Arizona Railway. We had all kinds of events going on that year. I know the board of directors was pretty tied up. We had a centennial committee that had everybody pretty well tied up. But in June of that year, I reached back out to NCTD again. And at that point, they replied with some more certainty here that, hey, we revisited our grant conditions. It says in no uncertain terms that these locomotives have to be scrapped. So I said, okay, I'm gonna go talk directly to the California Air Resources Board. So I reached out, just a complete cold call through their public inquiry line, just one of those website contact us forms. And I basically just pled our case in very general terms at the time. Hey, there's an agency retiring a bunch of locomotives. They got one of your grants. The grant says they have to be scrapped. How would one go about changing that so we could save one of them? And they said, talk to the San Diego County Air Pollution Control District. There's over 30 of these districts throughout the state of California, and they govern these air quality issues at a regional level. And then they all go back to CARB. CARB makes the regulations. These districts carry out those regulations. So I talked to the county people, and they said they would consider giving us an exemption to the scrapping requirement, but only if the engine on the locomotive was disabled. They were really, really firm about that one. And it was something that they and CARB both reiterated. Permanently removing the source of pollution is fundamental to the grant.
Yeah.
This is our only public charter for having this grant. We will not budge on this. We tried to pursue a loophole. We had heard through sources we trust that engines built pre-1975 could be exempted from this scrapping requirement just due to their historical nature. Did a little digging. NCTD took some photos of the builder's plates on the engines for us. Remember, I mentioned that the locomotives were built with some remanufactured parts. So we thought maybe we'll be able to slide in with that one. No dice. The engines were not that old. So after some back and forth between July and September of 2019, the Air Pollution Control District agreed that it would support what they call a case-by-case determination. And that's basically something they submit to CARB for approval. And the way that they were going to structure that was that NCTD could fulfill their grant obligations by disabling a locomotive, i.e. cutting a hole in the engine blocks. I say blocks plural because it applied to both the prime mover engine and the head end power engine, because they're both polluting engines. They're not EPA Tier 4 compliant. And the disabled locomotive could then be donated to us. And NCTD could still meet their grant obligations by following through with these steps. So we re-engaged with NCTD to get them involved in the conversation, make sure they and the county people were talking to each other. There was quite a bit of deliberation between the two of them on the language. I'm glossing over a lot of back and forth. They were reaching out to us. You know, what do you want to do with the locomotives? What's your objective here? Would you accept a locomotive with the engines completely pulled out of them? Like, Well, why would you do that? That's just a bunch of work. So this was a very active time with lots of back and forth. NCTD was also internally deliberating because at this point, they still hadn't really decided, well, is this going to be a donation? Is this going to be a sale? We don't really know what this is going to look like. Now, the first sign of things to come, as you'll see here, was an October email from NCTD. Would you accept all 5 locomotives? And I think I brushed it off at that point and responded like, that's not what we're looking for here. We only want one of these things. But the county people went ahead and submitted the request for the case-by-case determination to CARB in November of 2019. The call with Matt Tucker. Matt Tucker was the executive director of the North County Transit District at the time. And in December of 2019, I got a phone call from him in the middle of a workday. And he asked a very direct question. Will you accept the donation of all 5 locomotives? And there was a very clear insinuation in that, and with the follow-up conversation I had with him, that if NCTD was going to move through with us, if they were going to go through all this effort to donate these locomotives to us, they want us to take all of them off their hands. They don't want to have to deal with all this for one locomotive and then still figure out how to dispose of the others. I very clearly explained to Matt Tucker our situation. Our railroad is not connected to the national rail network right now. We cannot afford to truck 5 locomotives to Campo. It's cost prohibitive. So the conclusion of that conversation was that NCTD would look into the costs of moving those locomotives by truck.
Jeez.
So there were some additional back and forth clarifications between the county air pollution people and CARB in December. They asked us, are you actually taking 5 locomotives? And I tried to explain to them, well, yes, but I don't know how we're going to do it. We haven't really completely said yes to this yet. We had to decide then, if we're gonna get 5 locomotives, what are we gonna do with all 5 of them? Well, obviously, one of them is gonna be the primary candidate for preservation. We're not gonna try to fully restore 5 locomotives. That's just not realistic. So what do we do with the other 4 then? Well, our idea at the time was that one would become a parts supply for us, whether it would be cosmetic parts or mechanical parts. A lot of the parts are compatible with our older EMD locomotives, the GP9s, maybe even some off the EMD MRS1s. So this could have been a cash cow for us. We could have had lots of parts to use internally, or we could have sold the other parts out. And then that segues into what do we do with the other 3 of them? Do we part them out in-house? I remember we had that idea at one point. Do we scrap them in-house? Do we turn them into cabins? Is anyone familiar with the Isaac Walton Inn in Montana? They have a great couple accommodations you can stay in up there. One of them is a caboose or a series of cabooses. One of them is an old Santa Fe F45 engine or some variant of that. They completely gutted the engine room. They sealed the exterior, cosmetically did up the exterior. And then once they had moved it to the inn there, they furnished it out as a rustic cabin. The engine room doors, I can't remember if they just took those off or if they built the windows behind them, but it's got those big swinging engine room doors and they have giant picture windows in the side. And people can pay to stay in this thing. It's like a hotel room, basically. A lot of work to get something to that point. Now, finally, we were thinking, well, we could potentially donate these locomotives to other organizations. And it didn't take long after we had started really talking with NCTD that other organizations and companies started to hear about these plans.
Ah,
They were reaching out to NCTD saying, hey, could we get one of these locomotives? Or they were saying, hey, we might want to buy one of them. And NCTD was saying, go to PSRMA.
God, this thing to deal with.
So we had quite a few inquiries. Okay, 2020. Everybody knows what happened in 2020. But before COVID really became a factor, we had a few things in January that happened. On January 28th, CARB officially approved the case-by-case determination for the locomotives. So as of that point, it was now, from a regulatory perspective, permissible for NCTD to donate the locomotives to us. So that really cleared the way for us to start moving forward on this in earnest. The county folks would spend most of 2022 working with NCTD to draft up the language for the agreement that they would ultimately have to sign with us and NCTD. Now, you remember NCTD had promised that they would look into trucking the locomotives to Campo. So they spent about 3 months looking into that. And in March of 2020, right around the time the pandemic was really shutting everybody down, they came back to me and they basically told me the same thing that I could have told them. It's cost prohibitive. So where are we at? If we want to move forward with this, we have to figure out how we're going to get these things to Campo by rail. And I explained to them again the situation we're in. Our railroad is not connected to the national rail network. We've got all these problems that we have to deal with. We're going to need some financial help. And NCTD said, okay, tell us how much that's going to cost and we'll cover your costs within reason. So, getting the locomotives to Campo by rail. This is a map of the route that they would have taken if they came by rail, and it's color coded here. This orange section would be hauling the locomotives by the BNSF railway from their Stewart Mesa maintenance facility to BNSF's downtown San Diego yard. There was some talk about NCTD doing that move for us themselves, just to save us the headache of BNSF having to do that move. This red section here would mean a move by the San Diego and Imperial Valley Railroad, or SDIY. That would have been on one of their nocturnal freight trains that runs over the trolley blue line, originally the South line, more originally the San Diego and Arizona Railway, down to San Ysidro. From there, it would have had to be interchanged to the Baja California Railroad, who is the rail operator on the Tijuana-Itacate Railway. They would have taken it as far as the international border, and at that point, we would have picked them up and taken them the rest of the way to our museum. So what are the obstacles to that? Tunnel 3, the tunnel just south of the US-Mexico border. That tunnel has been collapsed since the end of 2009. Bridges 60.08 and 60.93. Two bridges between Division and Campo that were out of service. Also, the track between Division and Canyon, which is our current western turnaround point, has been held out of service since 2017. It's a track issue. We're not regulated by the feds on track the same way we are on bridges, so we could make a hospital move over that track if we had to. So that wasn't nearly as big of a factor. As far as costs that we knew about going into this, we knew that there were going to be some railroad costs. Maybe we could negotiate our way out. We knew that we'd have to repair Tunnel 3. It's been attempted before and that it failed. And we knew that we had to get those bridges inspected and through the load rating process. More on that in a minute. So let's look at Tunnel 3 first. Tunnel 3 is east of Tecate, just south of the US-Mexico border. It is on the Tijuana-Itacate Railway. This railway is owned officially by the state of Baja California, Mexico, and it is administered by this very long agency, which I'm not going to read off, shortened to ADMI Carga. Tunnel 3 was built as an earthen timber line tunnel. So it's through soft earth. You need a timber lining in order to hold that tunnel up. On December 25th, on December 25th, 2009, a fire started inside that tunnel and it burned out the timber lining. Several hundred feet of the tunnel collapsed at that point. In 2016, ADME Cargo received a grant to daylight that tunnel. So they would basically dig the tunnel out, they would turn it into a large deep cut in the earth. They hired a contractor to do that work, and the contractor completed that work in 2017. Not long after that happened, the slopes on either side of that tunnel slid back in and reburied the track. The reason for that is that the slopes were cut too steep. This is the state of the tunnel today from a bird's eye view. You'll see more close-up photos a little later. You can see this entire hillside here is destabilized. There's large cracks up here in the earth. So this whole hillside came down on this tunnel. The tunnel is on the order of 800 feet long. The actual portion that's buried here is about 300 feet long. This is several tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of soil. So obviously you need to clear that before you run anything through the tunnel. Bridges. Bridges are regulated by Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 237. Those regulations say that every railroad bridge needs to receive a one-time safe load rating. This is an engineering analysis that's done on the bridge to calculate how much weight that bridge can carry. It's a function both of the bridge materials, the bridge geometry, and also the types of equipment you're going to run over it. A diesel locomotive places a slightly different load on a bridge than a steam locomotive does, just because of the weight distribution on the axles and how the axles are spread out. There's 3 bridges that we operate over, or I should say that are on our railroad between Campo and the international border. Bridge 65.27, which is pictured here, is just west of the Highway 94 crossing in Campo. This bridge is up to date on its inspections and it has had a load rating performed on it. We operate trains over it every weekend. This picture was taken after we did a project on it in 2021 to replace the handrails and to patch up some cracks in the abutments. Bridge 60.93 is a small bridge over Highway 94. If you ever drive out to Campo, you'll pass under that bridge about 5 to 10 minutes before you get to the museum. There are no inspections on file for the bridge in the last 10 years. There is no load rating on file for the bridge. Bridge 60.08, the lower Campo Creek Viaduct, just east of Tunnel 4 and the international border. No inspections at that time, no load rating on file for it. Just a couple pictures of the bridges there. So in April of 2020, NCTD asked us to please put in writing that we will formally accept the donation of the 5 locomotives. So we met as a board of directors, and of course it was pandemic times at that point, so it was over Zoom or whatever Google Meets we were using at the time. And we drafted and executed a resolution saying that we would accept the donation of the 5 locomotives contingent upon a lot of financial assistance from NCTD. So what was our game plan for the bridges? We're fortunate that our library has an extensive collection of original records from the construction of the railroad. That includes the as-built drawings for the bridge there at Division, which was the more critical of the two just because of the sheer size of the structure. We got a cost proposal from my company, RailPros. We asked them to give us a proposal to do the safe load ratings on those 2 bridges there. We also asked them to do the annual inspections on those 2 bridges and 65.27, just so all the bridges would be current and we could carry them forward as a group. It's hailing outside. For these load ratings, rail pros would have to do extensive field measurements on the bridges. They'd have to get the copies of the as-built plans from us. And they also needed weight distribution diagrams for the locomotives. The game plan for Tunnel 3 was a lot shakier from the beginning. We had to talk to Admi Carga and the Baja California Railroad about repairing Tunnel 3. We had to figure out which party was really responsible for reopening the tunnel. Are we gonna have to pitch in on the cost to repair or expedite the repairs on the tunnel? Here's the thing though. In 2020, Baja California Railroad was still very much public that they were going to reopen the desert line and start running freight trains through Campo. I think many of us had our doubts that it was realistic, but you think they're being so public about this, they've got millions of dollars worth of work they have to do on the desert line to make it viable. They have to have a plan to get this tunnel open sooner or later. So it's really not that crazy to think that the tunnel wasn't that far from being reopened at the time. We had to give a cost proposal to NCTD though, because they needed to factor this in on the agreement. We knew that it would cost something to do that move with BNSF. We had talked to SDIY and Baja California Railroad at this point. They had promised us a free move, so that wasn't really a factor. We knew how much it was going to cost to do those inspections and load rating on the bridges, $33,635. We knew that we could get away with a hospital move on our track without having to do any track repairs. What we didn't know was how much Tunnel 3 would cost. We couldn't hold this up figuring out Tunnel 3. NCTD needed their numbers now. So what we agreed on was that NCTD would front the known costs and we were on our own on Tunnel 3. So whose responsibility was Tunnel 3? Well, like I said, the track and right-of-way was owned and administered, I should say, by Admi Carga. So it's their tunnel. It was their contractor that tried to repair the tunnel and the repair failed. Admi Carga doesn't run trains. They only benefit from the tariffs on the goods that are shipped in and out of the TNT railway. Tunnel 3 brings them no immediate benefits. It's east of all of the active freight operations in Mexico. Even if Baja California Railroad never gets the desert line reopened, it's going to have no impact on Admi Carga's ability to continue to make money on the Mexican freight operations because they can still ship everything out west. How about Baja California Railroad? Well, they need Tunnel 3 open to operate trains on the desert line. The Tunnel 3 repairs were left unfinished by Admi Carga. Baja refused to touch it. So that left us in a quandary. Baja and Admi Carga are in this fight about whose job Tunnel 3 is. Do we really have to intervene on this to make one of them pay for it? Apparently so. In October of 2022, NCTD and the air pollution folks finally finished drafting a memorandum of understanding. And this was provided to us for review and edits. It's a legal document, probably 7 or 8 pages long, not even worth talking about 90% of what was in it. But here are the main points. They would donate the 5 locomotives to us. They would write us a check for $33,635 for the bridge work. They would cover the costs of shipping the locomotives by rail. We agreed to get the locomotives to Campo. Repairs to Tunnel 3 implied. The CARB requirements for disabling the locomotives would carry through from NCTD to us. So in other words, once the locomotives got to us, we aren't just home free to do whatever we want with them. The locomotives had to be moved by April 15th, 2021. And the ownership of the locomotives would transfer to us once they were physically moved to Campo. All parties executed this agreement in November of 2022.
2020.
I'm sorry, 2020. Yep. So this is a tight timeline. From the time we signed this, we only had 4 months to get these locomotives off of their property. There's no way we could have Tunnel 3 open by then. Even if everything went hunky-dory with all the stakeholders, that's a pretty quick turnaround to do such a big earthworks project. So we knew from the beginning that we needed somewhere to store the locomotives in the interim. And this is really the first time that we contemplated this issue of temporary storage for the locomotives. We needed to find a location in or around San Diego County where we could store the locomotives while we tackled the Tunnel 3 issue. The location needs to be economical, it needs to be secure, or they need to be willing to let us put in some security fencing. And with that, we started investigating locations. The first place we looked at was a disused spur track next to a warehouse in San Isidro. Diana Hyatt, the president at the time, knew an employee there, an old friend of hers. So she reached out and asked, what would you guys charge if we wanted to store a locomotive here? Several locomotives here. Can't remember what the initial talk was, but they spoke in general terms, and I think they threw out the number of, for $5,000 a year, you could store them all here. Well, that's not bad, $5,000 a year. I think we can afford to cough that number up for a few years. 2021, the hardest year. So February 5th, 2021, Coaster officially retired the F40s. That was the last revenue operating day for the locomotives. 2101 and 2103 were the last two in service. They were retired unceremoniously. There was no pomp and circumstance about the retirement. The last locomotive basically pulled the last train of the day to Stewart Mesa Yard at about 8 p.m. out of Oceanside, and that was it. Last time they ever pulled a passenger train, revenue passenger train on the main line. Shortly thereafter, they started torching the holes in all of the engine blocks. A footnote here, the replacement locomotives, the Siemens SC44 Chargers, showed up on the property about 6 months earlier. They've been in commissioning and testing ever since then. At the time, Coaster was not running on the weekends due to the pandemic. So F40s saw their last day on Friday evening. Monday morning, the Chargers were in service. It was a completely seamless transition. Later that month, Diana Hyatt, Hector Gonzalez, and I met with the director of Admi Carga at their office in Tijuana. And we pled our case. Said, hey, we need to get equipment to our museum in Campo. We understand that you and Baja have some unsettled differences of opinion on the tunnel, but they need to get the desert line open anyhow. What's it gonna take for you guys to get this tunnel reopened? And their response was pretty blunt. We don't have budget for that. We don't have budget for it. We're not gonna start coughing up money to do that. But they would give us permission to work on the tunnel ourselves.
Very sweet.
So with that, we were on our own. We had permission to work in the tunnel if we needed to, but we weren't gonna get any help from Admi Carga. We already knew we weren't gonna get any help from Baja. Oops. So later that day, we actually did a site visit to Tunnel 3 while we were still down there in Mexico. For whatever reason, several hundred feet of track leading into the tunnel from the west had been pulled up. Can't remember the story on that. I don't know whether they were borrowing rails and ties for track work west of Tecate, or maybe it was just vandals getting some quick cash.
It goes underneath the border.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. It's a
They made it in
drug
Toyota Tacomas.
There you go.
tunnel underneath the O-tie. O-tie, under the outside border, to carry drugs.
Good tunnel.
So, walking along the tunnel here. This is what you see as you're walking towards the east end of the tunnel.
You can drive over that no problem with a speeder.
Now, I'd like to point out that up at this point, there were some people actually asking me, well, how many days with our backhoe would it take to go in there and dig that out? Well, have you seen these photos? I think Hector in that photo was standing about 40 feet above the top of rail elevation, and the track runs right about there. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of this landslide. That's looking almost directly straight up. And I didn't include some of the photos that I had gotten that were looking so far up that you couldn't really tell what you were looking at, but it's basically 100+ feet of almost vertical wall of unstable rocks and soil that are just precariously hanging up there. And you saw the overview photo earlier of the deep fissures in the earth above where the slide happened. That's looking at it from the east end, looking back west. So we have our work cut out for us. Bridge inspections and measurements. RailPros was out at Campo in February, later that month. In fact, it might have been just a day or two after that site visit we did on Tunnel 3. They got all the measurements they needed over the course of 3 days. So that knocked out the annual inspections and all the measurements they needed for the load ratings. Later that year, we also provided a series of numbers to them for all of the weights and axle spacing on the locomotives. So this was their typical diagram that they drew up of the wheel arrangement for the diesel locomotives. This was the table that we filled out with all the wheel spacing, all the locomotive weights, the individual axle loads on each wheel. And we also did that exercise for the steam locomotives too, figuring we're getting all this work done. We might as well make sure that we know that everything we own can safely pass over these bridges. Doesn't really cost anymore. As it turns out, the F40s are actually the heaviest axle load locomotives out of anything that would have been in our collection. They have about 70,000 pounds per axle, which is slightly higher than anything else we own. So, one of the first disappointments of 2021. The first warehouse location fell through. The company was bought by new owners who didn't tell anything to their employees until the sale went through. And on day one of the new ownership, the employees went back to, or the employee we had been talking to went to the new owners and pitched the idea to them about storing the locomotives, and they said, how about $5,000 a month? That's kind of the go away number right there. $60,000 a year is not sustainable. We cannot afford to get ourselves in a position of having the locomotives there with nowhere to go and have a $60,000 payment each year. So we started searching other locations in earnest all around San Diego County. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a general description of the areas that we were looking. There were anywhere from maybe 1 to 3 track locations in each of these areas. We looked in Miramar. We looked in National City, Chula Vista, Tijuana, Garcia, Tecate. We were even considering getting a spur rebuilt on the east side of Tecate in a scrap facility, who was friends with Diana, who said that he would hold the locomotives there. We looked everywhere for places that we could store them. This photo here is a team track that's off of the MTS system in National City. This was the most serious location that we were pursuing at the time. We started going up the chain at MTS to see if they would lease this location to us. It was not ideal. It was not enclosed. There was a major street right beyond the ends of the tracks there. There was an opening in the fence right here. And the railroad right of way off the edge of the screen to the left there was more or less unsecured. So we would have had to have built some fencing at this location to make it work. We did our first visit to the Stewart Mesa Maintenance Facility on March 31st of 21. This was a visit that was included in the MOU that we'd have the right to go up there and inspect all the locomotives. So the goal of this trip was to do a thorough walkthrough of all of the locomotives, document the condition that they were in, and pick out this primary candidate for preservation out of the 5 of them. So this is just a series of photos from the walk around here. I went up there with Ron Hyatt and Martin Pastecker. We had an escort from NCTD, one of the guys I've been working with there. By the way, that is a really weird scene, seeing them all stretched out like that. After having seen them all one by one pulling trains for so many years, seeing them in a deadline is always a little shocking. I'm sure anybody who's seen an older deadline back in the day could say the same thing. It's kind of a sobering sight. We did a thorough walkthrough of all 5 of the locomotives. I think this couple photos here was from inside 2101. You can just see there the hole they had cut in the engine block. These photos here were taken inside 2103. The one thing that I wish we'd thought to do on that date was to close these valve covers on the engines. They left these open and they sat like that for about a year. So there was a little bit of rusting that happened inside the top decks of the engines during that year. Just some more photos inside 2103 there. These are a couple of photos inside 2105. This was the first one they had pulled out of service. I think this one turned a wheel last in August of 2020. So they had started cannibalizing it for parts. You can see here, they pulled out the 2 headlight switches. And this was common to all of them. This here was where the positive train control screen was. So these locomotives had received positive train control equipment fairly late in their lives. The equipment was still pretty new. It was a probably $1 million per locomotive investment. So NCTD didn't want to lose that investment. They pulled all of that equipment out. They also pulled the radios out, and they pulled quite a bit of equipment out of them, like security cameras, forward-facing cameras, anything that wasn't really needed for them to just be able to roll over the track, they pulled out. We did also get the opportunity during that visit to take a tour through their facility. I was geeking out. That was probably a lifelong dream up to that point of getting to tour through that facility. It is in the middle of the Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Air Base, so not everybody can just set foot in that facility. I'd always wondered what it looked like inside that shop. And it's really not much more of a shop than we have. It's got 2 tracks in it, an inspection pits. It's got a series of servicing railings that are on either side of the pit for locomotive and car servicing. Funny story, they have to be able to lift cars inside that building. When they first designed the building, they didn't account for how high the car would be off the ground when it was up in the air. They didn't build the building tall enough. So they had to go back at the last minute and double half the height of the building for that one spot where they have to jack cars and locomotives up.
Sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? So that's a photo of their servicing rack there. That was a rail car that they had parked up alongside the rack. They were in the process of doing those upgrades to the coaches that I had mentioned earlier in the presentation. They also had one of the locomotives, the new Charger locomotives in the shop, just undergoing a periodic maintenance and servicing. That's their big parts supply there in the far corner of the shop. There was a lot of stuff I wish we had grabbed. They had original fire extinguishers out of the locomotives that actually said like F40 PHM-2C on them. I think they were actually numbered for the locomotives. They had all kinds of goodies there. They also let us tour through the cab of that Charger locomotive that was sitting in there. These aren't the greatest photos because of the lighting here, but I think you can get some idea of just how space age these new locomotives look compared to the F40s. They're just a completely different animal. They're more like a trolley than a diesel locomotive. And I've heard some people in the railroad industry refer to them as propulsion units as a pejorative. They refuse to call them locomotives. Look at how shiny and clean those were on the inside. I made a joke at one point. I sent one of these photos out to a group of volunteers and said, hey, we've had a change of plans. We've decided not to get the F40s. We're going to take delivery of one of these Chargers instead. Because they're so nice and clean. But the upshot of that visit, and really the most significant point here, was that we selected 2103 as the preservation candidate. It was a combination of our own observations and NCTD's recommendations. They themselves said that it was in the best condition mechanically. It was in fair cosmetic condition. It might not have been in the absolute best, but it definitely wasn't in the worst cosmetic condition. And it was the last of the 5 locomotives to go through that midlife rebuild program. I think it went through that in 2007. So it's the newest of the bunch. Now, stuff was really going downhill at this point on the storage situation. That storage track at National City fell through. MTS leadership didn't want to lease it. So that was the end of that. At this point, we had only about 10 to 15 days until the MOU ran out. So we had to go back to NCTD and the county people and beg for an extension. We had a decent justification for that one. We really hadn't been given that much time, even from when the locomotive custody was released to us. So we were able to argue between that and the storage situation that we needed more time. There was quite a bit of deliberation on that one, but they finally agreed to execute a restated MOU that would give us until the end of that year. One little quirk of that MOU was that they also transferred ownership of the locomotives to us on the spot. I think they figured at that point that they're out of service now, they're ready to hand over, no sense in us retaining ownership. So as of that, we officially own the locomotives. So we pursued additional storage locations over that time. We obviously continued pursuing the Tunnel 3 issue also. The first thing we did was we commissioned a geological survey of the tunnel by a Mexican company that specialized in geological, geotechnical, and survey work, EPGC. For $10,000, they actually produced us about a 100-page report. It was all in Spanish. I had some fun with a coworker of mine who's bilingual, kind of translating the most salient points in the report. But there were some good points that came out of that report. They characterized the landslide zones in the tunnel. They had recommendations for the areas that were most immediately in need of being worked on, and they had some engineering solutions for that. Here's what you should consider digging out. Consider putting some soil nails in here, maybe some shotcreting here, so on and so forth. With that in mind, and through my coworker who had some connections to contractors in the Tijuana area, we reached out to an earthworks contractor in Tijuana, and we asked them to put together a proposal for us. They actually did go out on a limb and do quite a bit of site work for us for free. So I appreciate that they did that for us. And the basic parameters of the project would be clear the fallen soil and rocks from the tunnel area, knock down the unstable areas above, cut the slopes back, and create some earthen berms to protect the track from any more landslides. They turned it around maybe within a month. And the quote came to us in pesos, so of course we had to translate that to US dollars. And with the exchange rate at the time, that came out to $308,000. We hit a brick wall. We had that much money in the bank, but we would have just about bankrupted ourselves if we coughed up that money. So that's it. We can't go any further with this tunnel for the time being. This is going to become a long-term solution. This is no longer the critical path. Well, the good news is that RailPros completed the bridge load ratings. They got the first one for the bridge at Dogpatch done in July. The division bridge load rating wouldn't come until early 2022, but at that point, like I said, it wasn't really a critical path item. So it was beneficial, wasn't really time critical anymore. The next several months were really not a good time. There was a lot of back and forth. We tried to jumpstart communications with BNSF about moving the locomotives. There was a lot of time wasted with phone tag, people being out on vacation, them telling us one thing and then it getting lost in translation about what it meant to actually store a piece of equipment on their system. What I was eventually able to get out of them is that they have a process called the industrial track agreement process. And that's basically, there's a track that's connected to their system somewhere. They have to decide whether it even makes economic sense for them to serve that track. And if so, they go through all the approvals to where they'll switch equipment in and out of that track. And that takes about 3 months. Now that's for a track owned by a third party. So you still have to have some kind of lease with that third party. If you were to go through this process on a BNSF owned track, that's about a 6-month process. If it's a third party track, for the cheap time frame of 3 months, it could be yours. BNSF didn't own a single track in San Diego County they were willing to lease. So it was only third-party tracks that we could pursue. The storage situation just wasn't panning out. There was a location in San Marcos we looked at. Owner was unresponsive. The location in Chula Vista that was actually really promising from a facility perspective didn't pan out. The owners wanted too much money for it. Lots of tracks up in Miramar that we were looking at. We finally found one track in Miramar that was really promising. There's a curved warehouse building up there that had a track next to it that we knew cars had been stored in very recently, but it didn't seem like it was happening on the regular. We got in touch with the owner of that property and they seriously considered it. They basically said, look, we don't really care about that track. We don't really want to do anything with it. If you don't need anything from us other than just us letting you use it, then that'll be it. So we started this industrial track agreement process with BNSF and that track owner. The clock's ticking now. It's about a 3-month process. Well, turns out that location didn't work. I finally actually got out there and took some measurements in November. At some point very recently, this building owner had installed these 2 staircases between the building and the track. I think they're fire exits, but they were within about 4 feet 9 inches of the track center line. A piece of equipment 10 feet 4 inches wide isn't going to fit past that. So we were SOL. And we brought the point up to the owner, hey, how much money would it take for you to get rid of these staircases? And they said, yeah, that's going to raise too many red flags at the corporate level. So unless you want to pay real money, forget about it. So we had to cancel that industrial track process with BNSF. It's about November 15th right now. We've got a month and a half left until our MOU runs out. Miramar was the last really good lead we had for a storage location. We had no way to get these locomotives to Campo, and we had nowhere to move them to. So we went back to BNSF as kind of a Hail Mary attempt to see if they could find one more location for us. And they did, actually. They put us in touch with the Port of San Diego. This is a distribution facility that they have in National City. It's an annex to the main port facility up at 10th Avenue. This track hadn't been used in years, and the port said they would consider leasing it to us for a nominal fee. We're talking maybe a few $1,000s a year. So we hit go on that. We started this 3-month industrial track agreement process again. But that was going to put us past December 31st. So we went back to NCTD one more time and said, look, we finally have some progress here, but this delay is outside of our control. We need just a few more months. And they said, okay, we'll give you 1 second and final extension. There will be no more extensions. That's it. You're done. April 15th, 2022 is your deadline. You have until then to get them off our property, or we're going to have a problem. So 2022, the year it would all happen or fall apart. We made really good progress with BNSF and the Port of San Diego. We were in regular communication. We were negotiating the storage rates. We were starting to talk about getting access to the site while the locomotives were stored there. They had 24/7 security. The site was fenced in. This probably would have been the best location out of anywhere we looked that we could have stored these things. We cleared multiple hurdles in the industrial track leasing process. In other words, BNSF got the first few approvals out of the way. It was getting close to the point where they were ready to actually sign an agreement with us, and we were starting to talk about movement plans. And then it came all crashing down. In mid-January, the port abruptly decided that they were not interested in moving forward. The justification they gave me was that they didn't want to preclude themselves from using that track in the future, because we kind of had an indefinite timeline at that point for how long the locomotives would sit there. So they were concerned about that. And that's it. Process evaporated. Industrial track leasing process is null and void. It's a moot point now. If we're going to do anything now, we've got basically to restart 3 months. And keep in mind, mid-January, you've got 3 months until the MOU runs out. And this is if we were to find a new location tomorrow. This was an emotional low point on the project. I cried during a board meeting. It was that bad. So we figured out this isn't working. We've got to change gears. We're not going to get these 5 locomotives. It's not possible. We need to come up with a new solution quickly. That's going to look something like trucking 2103 to Campo, whatever those costs may be. And the rest of the locomotives are just going to have to be disposed of. They're our problem, but we got to get rid of them. How are we going to get 2103 to Campo? It has to be trucked. All these questions come up. Where are we going to bring in a truck to pick it up? Can it be lifted and trucked in one piece? The last time we moved a locomotive, which was 3709, the GP9 that we just got up and running, we had to pull it off of its trucks. Do we have to do that again? Can it be moved in one piece? We don't know. What kind of cranes are needed to lift it? If we've got such a heavy locomotive with trucks attached, the crane vendors we normally work with have a crane big enough to lift it. We don't know. What kind of truck could actually carry such a long locomotive? It was longer and heavier than any diesel locomotive that we had acquired by truck. What do we do with the rest of the locomotives? Do we sell them to a scrapper? Do we sell them to other museums? We have to get rid of them somehow. Where are we gonna move them? I mentioned earlier that other organizations had been reaching out to us with interest in these locomotives. The Southern California Railway Museum and their associates had expressed a lot of interest in the F-40s, particularly locomotive 2105. So shortly after we had made the decision that we needed to get rid of these locomotives, that's really when we started seriously talking with SCRM about donating them. So we need a location where we can lift this locomotive up off the track. We went back to BNSF to pull one more favor, and they came through on this. They referred us to a company called Plastic Express, who's a customer of theirs all throughout Southern California. They lease a track from BNSF in National City. I reached out to the regional VP of Plastic Express. This guy's an angel. I can't even express how generous he was. He was generous. He got back to me right away, and he was accommodating. He would let us use their facility for free. And all we needed was to give proof of insurance for us and the contractors we were going to use. Now, as far as the cranes go, we contracted with Bob's Crane to provide the cranes. We have a previous working relationship with them. They're based out of Lakeside. They've done several jobs for us previously, including that SP 3709 move. They did a field visit with me to the Plastic Express facility just to make sure that there was enough room to maneuver cranes and the truck in there. And their plan was to supply a 275-ton crane and a 350-ton crane. Now, as far as trucking goes, we contracted with a Florida-based company called North American Heavy Haul. They would have the high-level oversight of the trucking plan. Most of the work was actually subcontracted to a company called Contractors Cargo Company. They're a Compton-based company. They have the distinction of having moved every one of the NASA space shuttles at some point in their existence. They've got some really cool photos on their website. And the plan they came up with was that they would use two giant highway dollies to move 2103. They would provide for route survey, permitting, and highway patrol escorts. Now, they had to figure out quite a few logistics here. They needed time to plan the route out. They had to survey the route. They had to design the load, so to speak. So they had to figure out how the locomotive would sit on these two dollies and how it would all be maneuvered. They had to pull permits at both a county and state level. And obviously they had to find a time when these dollies were not being used on other jobs. They came up with a detailed plan of the move that included a turn-by-turn document that was about 4 pages long, with every single turn that the route would take from National City to Campo. This process took months. We needed more time. They weren't going to have this done by April 15th. So we still needed somewhere that we could move 2103 temporarily. And what about all these other locomotives? I talked again about all those companies reaching out to us. This locomotive rebuilding company, which shall not be named, had reached out to us wanting to buy the locomotives off of us. And they had this crazy idea of, well, we'll take all of them plus the one you want to keep and we'll repower it to Tier 4 standards so that you have an operating locomotive. And I told them, no, we're not interested in that. This is a historic locomotive. We don't just want to throw a Caterpillar engine in it and, make it sound like a diesel truck. So I had brushed them off at first, but they kept popping up again, and they had an offer to store locomotives, so I took them up on it. They said they would give us a small upfront payment to purchase the locomotives we didn't want. They'd convert these locomotives to be EPA Tier 4 compliant, which was permissible by that CARB agreement. And then they would resell them as brand new remanufactured locomotives. And they would give us a chunk of the proceeds for that sale. Seems like an okay deal if it works out. So we started moving forward with that. Martin and I did another visit to Stewart Mesa in March of 2022. The primary reason for that was to strip spare electronic components out of the locomotives that we intended to scrap. So these locomotives, if they got rebuilt, we're going to get all new electronic systems. None of this stuff would be reused. We figured we could at least get these small, easy to handle spare parts so that if we need them for 2103, we'd have them, and I'm sure they have some resale value. We also took some of these parts out of the other locomotives and swapped them in for 2103 for some of the parts that were falling apart there. Little stuff like windscreen visors and card holders on the back of the cab. And we made sure that the locomotives were ready for movement. Well, late March, the partnership with this locomotive rebuilder falls through. Their landlord didn't actually want to let them keep that many locomotives on their property indefinitely. So another idea out the window. Now we're back in the position of having to figure out where we're going to move these locomotives. This is probably the point where the project came the closest to completely falling apart. I don't think a lot of people realize that who have been following along on this. We came within 2 weeks of pulling the plug on this whole thing. NCTD reached out to me and said, we need an update on when you're moving these things. I explained this situation. They said, if you don't get these things moved by April 15th, we're ripping up this MOU. We're retaking ownership of these locomotives. You're done. Have a nice day. Last minute save. Coast Rail Services is a company based out of Anaheim that does re-railing or derailment cleanups, hospital moves, and equipment storage. Apparently they've been trying to reach out to us for a while, but didn't have my phone number. So I got in touch with them and the owner said, yes, I am interested in purchasing 3 of these locomotives. Yes, I am willing and able to store the other 2 for you for 3 months at no cost. That'll give you time to get your highway deal figured out. And we wrote that agreement with an option for them to buy the 2105 off of us if the agreement with SCRM fell through. So this is where things really heated up. Lots of last minute coordination with BNSF and Coast Rail Services and NCTD. We signed the agreement with Coast Rail Services. We got a nice $35,000 check out of that, I think, which was nice because it would offset a lot of the costs of the move. We had to gain ownership of the locomotives in an online system called Rail. It's something that the Association of American Railroads uses to track the ownership of all interchanged rail equipment. So NCTD had some guy in a back office who had an account for this system who probably hadn't used it in 10 years, but he got logged back into the system. We had to buy a subscription to the system. He got the ownership transferred over to us. That was actually when I learned that the reporting marks had never changed from SDNX. So that was kind of an interesting tidbit there. The locomotives had to receive an air test and inspection by BNSF. And finally, BNSF picked the locomotives up early in the morning on April 9th, 2022, 6 days before that MOU was due to expire. The locomotives were routed to Anaheim via Barstow and La Mirada. Unfortunately, While the train from Stewart Mesa to Barstow was en route, BNSF didn't have a crew to recrew that train out of San Bernardino. So they parked it on a siding called Ono, which is on the climb out of San Bernardino up towards Cajon Pass. They sat there for about 12 hours in broad daylight, completely unprotected. And there were numerous rail fans who broke into the locomotives and stole parts off of them while they sat there. Not much we could do about it. But the locomotives did arrive more or less intact in Anaheim a few days later. All 5 of the locomotives sat in Anaheim from April through June. Sometime around June or in May, one or more people who may or may not have also been rail fans, but probably had some knowledge of the value of locomotive parts, broke in and stole parts from several of the locomotives. We got lucky, they only stole the horn off of 2103. Other locomotives got number boards stolen. I know that we did get some light bulbs stolen, so we did not make it out of there unscathed. Coast Rail Services was furious. The owner got in touch with me. He asked if we would put out a social media post about it. Basically just begging and pleading the Railfan committee to out whoever had broken in and stolen. Because for us, it was a theft issue. For Coast Rail Services, it was a security of their facility issue. Nothing ever came of that. Nobody ever fessed up. Nobody ever returned the stolen parts. The permitting process with the county and the state dragged on through June. But they finally finished up in early June, and it was time for us to actually get things moving. We scheduled the move for mid-June. 2103 got a second air brake test, so it was ready to run. That test is good for 30 days from the point that it's done until the locomotives has to start getting moved in the system. We figured on a 1-week transit via VNSF, and that was actually about twice what it took for the locomotives to get up to Anaheim. So we figured that was plenty of cushion time, plenty of time for BNSF to get the locomotive to National City. Let's plan everything around that. So we had the crane scheduled, we had the truck scheduled, we made sure Plastic Express didn't need the track to unload any cars that particular week. And then the truck dollies got delayed. They were on another job. One of them had a mechanical failure, needed maintenance. Everything got held up. Now, we didn't want to send 2103 out on the railroad if it weren't going to be ready to pick it up. So we basically told BNSF, stop the waybill service. We don't want this thing leaving yet. In early July, we formalized and completed the transfer of Coaster 2105 to SCRM. A few months later, it was separately moved by BNSF to Commerce. It's currently sitting there waiting for SCRM to get their rail connection in downtown Paris rebuilt. And it's going to travel with a couple other locomotives to their museum on time and date to be determined. So 1 month after the first fall start, the truck dollies were ready at the beginning of July. So we went through the whole effort again to get everything lined up, schedule a date for the trucks, schedule a date for the cranes, scheduled to make sure Plastic Express wasn't going to be using that track. And 2103 was pulled out of Anaheim on the early morning of July 5th. That was the last day before the air brake inspection was due to blow up. So very fortuitous timing on that. The first and second legs of that trip were uneventful. The locomotive was brought to La Mirada that morning, and then that same day it was put on the La Mirada to Barstow freight to take it back up to Barstow. That's the way BNSF runs their system. They don't have a train that makes a set out or pickup in Anaheim that goes straight to San Diego. So you have to put it on a local to La Mirada, a regional train from La Mirada to Barstow, and then another regional train from Barstow to San Diego, and then finally a train from San Diego to National City to send it out here.
Up and down Cajon Pass.
Yep. Okay, at this point, I ran out of time on the PowerPoint, so I'm gonna ad lib some of this, but don't worry, the good photos and videos will come in a minute here. So, the locomotive got to Barstow and it sat, and it sat, and it sat for over a week. And I was calling BNSF customer service, I was calling their way billing people, I was trying to get an operations person on the phone. Why is this thing not moving out of Barstow? Come to find out about 2 weeks after the fact that, oh, something got messed up in our computer system. It registered your locomotive as an empty and it assumes that there's a 50-ton load in the locomotive. So it thinks it's 191 tons. The surf line down to San Diego has bridges that can't take 191 tons. So that's why the system wasn't releasing the locomotive for movement. So we fixed it. We just had to have them go into their system real quick and delete that extra 50 tons, and just like that, voila, it was released for movement. Now, I don't know if anyone remembers around the summer of 2022, the railroad industry as a whole was not in a great point around then. They were having labor shortages because of their own hiring practices. They were having backlogs of equipment building up that didn't have enough crews to take them over the railroad to their next destination. So even after we fixed this issue, I think the locomotive sat in Barstow for another week or at least half a week before it actually got on a train to San Diego. Now, mind you, we completely torpedoed that schedule we'd set for July. We couldn't hold the cranes up that long. We couldn't hold the trucks up that long. They did eventually move the 2 truck dollies down to San Diego later that month in anticipation of them. So they said, okay, we're committing these truck dollies to your job now. We're not going to schedule another job. They're there ready when you're ready. So the locomotive was on the move again. I think July 21st was around the date that it came down to San Diego. And at this point, I'm going to jump away from PowerPoint for a minute. I'll pull up some of the videos I got here. If this will load for me. Don't know if we're gonna get any audio here. You guys hear that? Really faintly? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you can just picture chugga chugga choo choo by the camera here. This was in Sorrento Valley.
Hey.
That was actually the first time I saw the locomotive in person since it had been at Stewart Mesa. Here's another video taken down at Old Town Transit Center. Probably had to be past midnight at this point when it was coming in. So there we go. 30 minutes after that was shot, it was in San Diego Yard. Okay, so it's in San Diego. We had set a new date for the move sometime about 5 days after we knew it was going to get to San Diego. Now Bob's crane had a problem. One of their cranes had gone down for maintenance, needed probably a week after coming off a job it had been on. So another delay. BNSF really did us a solid here. They normally charge what's called demurrage if a locomotive or car sits in their system for a certain period of time after it's delivered. Yeah. It sat in their yard for 2 weeks
Oh,
and they didn't charge us for that. They could have completely robbed us blind for how long it sat there. But they didn't, so they really did us a favor there. Move was finally scheduled. We set the date for the locomotive to be put on the truck for, I believe, August 3rd. Then it would leave National City on the truck on August 4th, arrive in Campo on August 8th, and then we would unload it on August 9th. So 2 days before the big crane lift was scheduled, BNSF moved it on its final leg down to Plastic Express. That happened late on Monday evening. And now we finally get to the good photos. All right, so here we are, about 6 a.m. Cranes just showing up there at Plastic Express, starting to figure out where they're gonna set the cranes up. The plan was that the cranes would be nearer to the locomotive and then the trucks would be pulled in opposite of the cranes. Now, we almost immediately ran into an issue. Plastic Express shares this facility with a company called Reliance Metal Center. They're a heavy steel supplier for the maritime industry. Think 1 to 3 inch thick steel plates sitting around on their property. Well, we had set this entire plan up based on BNSF spotting the locomotive at a certain spot along the track. And they set it up about 2 car lengths down from where that was, right next to where all those 50 to 100-ton steel plates were. I don't know how much they weighed, but they were big pieces of steel. Well, as you can see here, the cranes are setting up next to the locomotive. So what actually happened was the forklift operator for Reliance Metal Center got called by his boss, who obviously had a close working relationship with Plastic Express, I had called and said, hey, we've got a problem here. And the Metal Center management told the forklift operator, move those pieces of steel now. So he took his big forklift, he shoved them all about 150 feet farther up the track out of our way. And with that, the cranes were able to start setting up. If you've never seen a heavy crane like this get set up before, it's a fascinating process. Each crane is supported not only by the crane operator and the oiler, who's kind of like the fireman for a crane, but they also have a rigging truck with its own driver. And depending on the crane, anywhere from 1 to 4 flatbed trucks carrying counterweights for the cranes. So, again, I don't know how much of that really good stuff I captured in these photos here, but the cranes basically have to erect themselves. So they put down these jacking pads here. They extend the crane outriggers. The outriggers actually lift the cranes up off the ground, so all the weight is resting on the outriggers. There's no weight on the wheels. And then one by one, the semi-trucks pull up with the flatbeds pull up with the counterweights, and the cranes basically pick them up and place them on their own deck. And they just keep piling counterweights up until they have a whole stack of them built there. Once that stack is built, the crane swings around and with hydraulic rams picks up the counterweights. So the counterweights were sitting on the fixed bottom portion of the crane. Now they're lifted up with the rotating part of the crane. They also change out the smaller sheave block here, which they use for the counterweights, for a much larger one that they're going to use for the actual lift. You can see in the background here how many times the cables get wound around the sheaves. This process to erect the cranes took about 2 hours, once the cranes were actually in position. I think I misspoke earlier. By the time all the metal stuff had been moved, it was probably closer to about 8 AM when the cranes started setting up. So it took them about 2 hours to get to this point where the counterweights are set, they're up on their outriggers, they're starting to get the rigging set up. They have to use these big spreader bars here because from a single lift point, you need the vertical lifting load to be in line with the outsides of the locomotives or the locomotive. I don't remember if I got a good close-up of it. There's a bunch of those metal plates in the foreground here. But you can see they're getting their slings set up there. Oh, too far. There are lifting points on the locomotive at the 4 corners. They're centered just about in line with the centers of each truck on either side. There's a jacking point there as well, so you can lift them up from the bottom, or you can hook a sling up to lift them from up top. And they were able to lift the locomotive in one piece between these 2 cranes. That yellow one in the foreground there is a 350-ton crane. The white one in the background is a 275-ton crane. The lack of paint chipping around those lifting points before we lifted the locomotive tells me that it had never been lifted in that manner before. They had always jacked it up from underneath while it was in service. There are a couple more photos there of them getting that rigging all set up. Okay, now they're actually starting to hoist it into the air. I'd say it took them another 2 hours, probably, hour and a half, 2 hours to get all the rigging figured out. So by the time this lift was actually happening, this was just short of 12 noon. You can see here in the photo, it was taken at 11:54. Now, I've got to say, after you've seen them take that long to get the locomotive rigged up to go, when you actually see how quickly they're able to move it, it's almost incredible. It's just effortless. The cranes don't make any kind of indication that they're under any strain when they lift it up. You just kind of hear the engine rev up a little bit. Lifts up 141 tons. Now, the cool thing with how they had to do this was because the cranes were between the locomotive where it sat on the track and where the trucks had been pulled over. You can kind of see the truck dollies off on the left-hand side. They actually had to swing the locomotive almost 90 degrees to the track to fly it in between the 2 cranes.
Anybody flagging the BNSF freight line?
No, actually, so that's something I didn't even touch on. We had arranged for BNSF to have a flagger there all day to hold the track out of service for us. The guy was there right at 6 AM when I rolled up, and he said, well, how long is this gonna take? Like, well, the crane guys tell me this whole thing will be about 8 hours. I'm like, well, I'm busy. I gotta be out of here in 2 hours tops. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it's your problem. So he goes riding off in his high rail, and I ended up calling his boss, who is the head of flagging for BNSF for the region. And his boss said, oh yeah, don't worry about it. We're not sending any trains down there that day. You're good to go. Okay. The amount of coordination between the 2 crane operators is incredible also. They're in touch with each other by 2-way radio, just like the radios we use on the railroad. And they just had one spotter on the ground who was helping them maneuver. So you can see the cranes were kind of having to counter rotate against each other in order to get the locomotive rotated back into position there.
I think at this point you felt pretty good about it, probably arriving Campo sometime.
Yeah. Yeah, there was no turning back now.
Exactly.
By the way, these guys were great to work with. I absolutely loved working with these guys. They were super enthusiastic about the whole project. Great guys, very thorough in their planning for this move. They've obviously done this thousands of times before. They bought lunch for me. They gave me all kinds of free gear.
Okay.
These guys were just way too cool. And they thought this was cool, because normally they're used to hauling stuff like big generators or transformers or just heavy loads that would normally be on a flatbed semi. So for them to be moving a locomotive like this was pretty abnormal for them.
Oh, yeah.
This guy here is actually local to San Diego, so he played a big role in a lot of the planning for the trucking move. And he brought his son out with him too. I thought that was kind of cool that he was kind of passing the buck, showing him how to get into the industry. So actually what they did here is they lined up the rear truck of the locomotive first on this rear dolly here. And they worked on getting that chain down in place. And then they basically had the tractor with the front dolly move that one ever so slightly back and forth so that they could line that one up properly. Few more photos here. This was, you can see the timestamp here. This is only about 20 minutes after they first lifted the locomotive, and it's already sitting on the dollies. So they're just making some last minute adjustments here. They had some wooden blocking down there that they had to get shifted around so that the weight would bear on it correctly. I think they ended up having most of the weight from the truck go through the center bolster to sit on top of the wood blocking. Making some final alignments right there. What we just done? Oh, no, that was it. Okay. Oh, nope, just kidding. I'm missing a few photos in here, but it was just photos of them kind of getting the locomotive lashed down. Gosh, they must have had probably 30 chains with turnbuckles there to hold it all down, just so it wouldn't break loose. Okay. On to the actual move. So the lift was done on the night of, or on the day of August 3rd. They basically had it there for about 24 hours, and then the next evening, Thursday, August 8th, was the first night of the move. So I had mentioned earlier that they had to do a comprehensive route survey, and that was basically so that they knew all the different spots where there were low bridges, low utility clearances. If it was a fixed structure like a bridge, they just had to adjust the route to go around it. But for a lot of these overhead utilities, they would actually lift the utilities up while the locomotive passed under them.
Still pretty tight.
19 feet 6 inches when it was all put together. And what they had done was they had taken the PTC antenna risers off each end of the locomotive because those were the tallest objects on it. They also put 3 long strings of PVC conduit along the top. So that way, if any wires did droop onto the locomotive, they would slide along the PVC instead of snagging on radiator fans and lifting hooks and and all of those structures that are normally on top of the car body. So what you can see here in these first couple of photos, this is on 19th Street in National City, which is right off of the Plastic Express facility. They've got a couple bucket trucks that they rented for this move, and they had those lifting the cables up on these first couple of utilities here. You can just barely see right here, this was the first pilot truck that would go ahead of the move. And this truck here had this pole on the front of it. And the top 6 inches to a foot of that pole were the wiggle room. So that area was marked red. And it was okay if those clipped an overhead cable because that was within the tolerance of the height of the locomotive where those PVC conduits would be able to sweep the cable up and over. If it was below that little red tip on the white spot, then the utility was drooping too low, so they would have to push it up higher. If it was a heavy bundle of cables, they would use the bucket trucks to do it. If it was a lighter bundle of cables or a single cable, they actually had these fiberglass rods that have a little C cup at the top of them. And they would just extend those up to push the wires up and hold them. So this is the locomotive just turning out of the Plastic Express facility. We kept the move more or less under wraps. There were a few people who had found out about it and were out there shooting video of it, but for the most part, the move was pretty low key. Until, of course, this locomotive was going by people's houses, and then everybody knew about it.
Where?
By everybody's houses.
Yeah, what, a quarter mile by mine, and I didn't know. Me too. I went down to National City, I saw it.
So this is, you can see from the timestamp here, 10:30 or 10:23. So the locomotive had been moving since about 9:30. That was when CHP released it to start traveling on the roads.
Well, I had a pusher, okay.
You'll see in several of these videos here that CHP was escorting the move. They were running ahead of the move to block cross streets off, to block opposing traffic. There were several locations where they had to cross the center median of the street and travel the wrong way down the street for a couple blocks at a time. Sometimes that had to do with the turning radius at the next location where they had to make a turn. Other times it had to do with low overhead traffic signals. Now, in this particular location here, you can see that they're clearing the traffic signal just fine. Now, you'll see in a little bit here, the final trick they have up their sleeve is that at the locations where the traffic signals were just too low, they would actually get up in the bucket trucks, go up and turn the traffic signal head 90 degrees. So instead of hanging downwards, it was parallel and gave that extra 24 inches of clearance that they needed to get under it. You also saw in that video that there is a tractor pulling the front dolly and a tractor pushing on the rear dolly. Both of them were pretty heavily ballasted. They each had a couple of these 10-ton weights on the back. Or maybe they weren't 10 tons. They might have been 10,000 pounds, so 5 tons. But there were a couple each. And another kind of interesting thing is that for the majority of the move, they didn't actually need that rear tractor pushing. They only really needed it to make it up the steeper hills. So for a lot of the move, that front tractor was actually doing all of the work and the rear tractor was just idling. There were more than one occasion when they needed an extra guy on the ground to move an extra utility out of the way or to just hop in one of their chase trucks and drive it up a couple more blocks. So the driver in that rear truck would just hop out of it while it was getting dragged along by this whole consist and go walk up and do whatever he needed to do, and then just, all right, time to climb back up in the truck and ride in the tractor for another few blocks here. I think this was Fourth Street.
That's 8th Street.
And, okay, yeah,
8th and Euclid.
that sounds right, yeah. Also, you can see here, there's a rigging sling that was left connected to the locomotive there. Bob's Crane had such a heck of a time getting that thing in there the previous day that they just decided to leave it there so that it would be there for when they lifted the thing a second time next week. You can see a lot of the shackles and chains that they had holding it down there. In the foreground, they're lowering the bucket down. These are pretty nifty bucket trucks. I mean, you can control them from either inside the bucket or from in the truck bed there. So they wouldn't actually have a guy in the bucket to push the cables up. They would just use the bucket itself to raise those overhead wires. So Tim mentioned that this was 8th Street in National City. This was probably the slowest point of the entire trip. There were so many overhead wires in those two city blocks that they took about an hour to traverse that distance. You can see here the timestamp, 11:07 p.m. before they made that turn. This photo here was taken at 11:29. See, they're just barely getting it under some of those wires. And then this video here, which is 2 blocks up where they're making the next turn, was at 11:44. And in this video here, I don't think I actually got him physically turning the traffic signal head in this video. But the guy up there in the bucket truck is working on getting the first of those 2 heads turned. And they both needed to be turned out of the way in order to make enough room.
I assume they turned it right back after.
Flipped them
No,
upside
they
down.
just left it that way. And you can imagine with the locomotive on the dollies, and they've got to be able to do work ahead of it and behind it. There's just this constant buzz of activity of trucks going back and forth. And guys working on getting cables pushed up and out of the way.
Hey, Stephen, I know you said no questions until the end, but this question directly relates to this video. So Bryce wants to know, what is steering the rear dolly, the rear tractor?
The turning of the locomotive from the front was used to accomplish most of the turns. So that front tractor was doing most of the steering. And as it pulled around, it would pull the front dolly around, which would then rotate the locomotive and pull the rear dolly around. Now, that said, each dolly did have about half of its wheels on one end on a self-steering set of trucks that were hydraulically powered. So for some of the tightest turns that they had to make, particularly leaving the facility initially, they did actually have a guy out there who fired up the little engine that ran the hydraulic pump on each of the dollies, and then they would basically had this big rod that just actuated a valve that would rotate the whole wheel assembly left or right in order to make those turns. But for most of the more gentle turns on the route, they didn't have to do that. So this is just a short clip here. You can see both of the traffic signal heads have been turned up 90 degrees now. So he was just tightening them there so they wouldn't flop back down. It's pretty fortuitous that traffic signal heads are designed that way.
What if that's fortuitous or just at the design intent?
Couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
I'm a civil engineer, not a traffic engineer. So, let's see. Signal heads turned out of the way here. Now the truck is ready to resume moving. So there it is, 11:50 PM. So it took them 43 minutes to traverse those two city blocks. And I don't see the guy there with the little steering mechanism, so it looks like they were able to make this turn without having to make use of self-steering axles. By the way, each of those dollies had 32 wheels. They were divided in two halves. Each one had, so each end had 16 wheels. There were 4 sub-assemblies coming off of that, and each of those had 4 wheels.
How many wheels in total did they have on the ground, everything?
So between the two dollies, 32 wheels, then each of those trucks, let's see, those are 3 times 4, so 12 plus, I think just 2 up front, so 14, 28, so 64 plus 28, that's 92.
That's a lot of tires.
Yeah,
When
That's $400.
23 came up years ago, I think there was 92 wheels, but it wasn't that big.
yeah,
I would say close to 100.
yeah, quite a few.
Nice tires too.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't want to pay for one of those. One more thing I didn't mention, not only were the axles on these self-steering, but these truck sub-assemblies here could actually be moved in and out. So when it was traveling, the dollies had the wheels out at about 20 feet total, but they could be sucked into 15 or 16 feet. So that's how they were able to clear some things like the gates coming into our property. There's another run-by video. I think this is after they had made that right-hand turn and they're coming up on the next turn, so. Oh, what would that be? About 4 blocks east of 8th Street, so. I can't remember. Is that 4th Street, Tim?
Yeah, they turned up 4th.
Okay.
Makes me really wonder where the hell they're going.
They zigzagged all the way through National City.
Yeah. I'm sure it's because of bridge loading, but
They want to be following their serpentine.
Here's just a series of photos I took as they were making the next corner there. You can see some of the guys in the background there with the rods holding up the individual wires there. GHP guy there, keeping traffic out of the intersection, and then one of their chase trucks right there. This was another procession here. I want to say we're getting into Rancho San Diego at this point. I know I have the exact intersection written down somewhere where this was. They had gotten through a lot of the more difficult right and left turns at this point. They were actually going a few more blocks at a time without having to make these really slow turns. And you're getting into newer neighborhoods that have less overhead utilities here. So at this point, progress was definitely picking up, and the speed was being measured in tens of miles per hour instead of feet per minute. And I think that is the last of those videos I got of the move at night. I continued chasing the move until it got to the Hemishaw area. That was about 1 AM by the time I finally broke off the chase. That first night, they continued through Hemishaw and through the back way into El Cajon. They had to make a series of back and forth trips on the surface streets in El Cajon. They finally got onto Freeway 8 eastbound. I think they got on at Magnolia Avenue. And they parked the locomotive at about 4 AM just east of the Greenfield Drive exit on Interstate 8.
Well, I'm sure that didn't cause any traffic issues in the morning.
So I don't have any of them saved here, but I did get just a couple grab shots of the locomotive sitting there over the weekend. And that was probably the first time that the move really got a lot of public exposure, because it sat there from Friday morning until Sunday night. So 3 full days of people going by on the freeway. There's a housing development across the freeway there. Lots of people learned about this move over those 3 days.
Did CHP not want you to move on the weekends?
Yes, they would not permit a move on a Friday or Saturday night. So just because of how the timing had worked out, Friday morning, the move tied down, everyone went home, couldn't pick up again until Sunday night. I ended up getting 1 cell phone grab shot of the locomotive on the second night of the move on Sunday as I intercepted it on the way back from Campo. That night, the forward progress was obviously quite a bit faster. I don't have that video saved here, but they took it up Freeway 8 to Tavern Road in Alpine, got on Tavern Road, went out through Tavern, Hopatol Valley Road, back on Freeway 8 at Descanso. They went up to the Sunrise Highway exit there, got back off the freeway there, took Old Highway 80 to Old Buckman Springs Road to New Buckman Springs Road. Took that all the way down to the Highway 94 interchange there at Cameron Corners. And then made it in our front gate again about 3 or 4 AM on Monday morning. So it sat there in Campo on the truck dollies for a day on Monday. Then Tuesday, August 9th was the unloading day. So previous to this, we had moved the last couple cars off the west end of the house track there, just so that we had some room to work with, so that we could set the locomotive down right on the house track. A lot of this is kind of rehashing the process of setting the cranes up that you saw in previous videos. They temporarily disconnected that forward tractor there, so they were getting it linked back up. Cranes were getting set up. They loved our property because they had all the room in the world in that parking lot to maneuver all those semi trucks. There they are, getting the locomotive lifted up. Another video here. They had connected the air hoses for the truck dolly brakes from the front dolly to the rear dolly. And they hung a couple of those air lines off the underside of the locomotive. And they forgot to clip a couple of the zip ties here. So there was a brief moment of panic here where they had to stop the lift so that they could cut that last wire.
Just
or that last air hose down.
We're still going on.
We're almost done here. I promise. Save the good stuff for last.
Bruce is a party animal. He's usually out all night, so that's a good check.
It's so amazing when you see something like that in the air.
Isn't it? It's just effortless.
Did they ask when they got there which way you wanted the locomotive oriented?
They did. I was very deliberate. We've got too many west-facing locomotives. We need one to face east.
Hmm.
I'm surprised they didn't drive the truck out of the way.
They partially did.
If in case something happened, you wouldn't have to be taking a truck.
You can see they're pulling the rear dolly back at that point.
Doing that same dance between the cranes, huh?
Yep, same thing, have to swing it perpendicular to the track to get it through there. We had a crew down there ready to bring it up to the yard. So they were just over there getting a good show on the passing track. Many photos and videos were taken this day.
You don't realize how big it is until you see how small the people are.
Yes.
Because the trucks and the cranes are just as big, so it's just like, oh, okay, it just looks, normal, and then you're like, oh my god, that's a human.
Yeah. Now, and here's the crazy thing too. I know the trucking and crane guys are used to being around suspended loads like that. I wouldn't get within 100 feet of that thing while it was up in the air. I don't care how well they figured out all the weight calculations and how well anchored those cranes are. I'm not getting underneath that thing unless something topples over.
You've been watching too many of those videos.
It's the civil engineer in me. That was one of the semi-truck drivers there.
You the former truck driver and a crane operator.
No big deal.
I was there, I think I timed it from the time they lifted, it started lifting till it was on the rails, it was like less than 10 minutes.
Yeah, yeah, this was even faster, because instead of having to line it up with the truck dollies, they just had to get the
They just
wheels
picked it up.
lined up with the rails.
Yeah, as I recall, it was less than 10 minutes. After 2 hours of getting ready.
Yeah, yeah, 2 hours of crane setup, 2 hours of crane breakdown,
Yeah.
plus probably another hour and some change to get it rigged again. They were a bit faster getting it rigged the second time. They had a better idea of what kind of slings they needed. Slings and chokers, and I think they were much better prepared on the second day.
It's like the military, Jim. 6 months of training for 10 minutes of chaos.
Even setting that down, though, they'd have to come down exactly right. So they'd be straddling right.
You would be surprised how fine of a movement you can get with those cranes. They did one end of the locomotive at the time. They got the rear truck lined up, got it down on the rails so that the flanges wouldn't let it slip off. And then, same thing on the front, they just lowered it down. I think the flanges hung up on the railhead just a little bit on one side.
Did they have somebody down there looking at it?
Oh yeah, they had a spotter.
A spotter?
Can't quite see him in any of these photos. That's the spotter right there.
That's me. Everybody's lives are checking in.
Good thing I don't have wires. How it takes to me like 40 minutes. It's like, oh,
I know it was low to the ground at this point, but I was still a little nervous getting too close with how it was swinging back and forth like that.
Because if something's being loose, you have cables flying through the air.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what you really don't want. You don't want the rigging to give way. Yeah. There. one set of flanges just hung up on the railhead the first time they set it down. So they just ever so slightly lifted it and gave it a little nudge over and set it right back down.
Well, the lift is under the body, not under the trunk, is that right?
Correct. That's one of the lifting points right there. It's just inside of being in line with the outside of the car body there.
Yeah.
All right, so had to get some group photos there. The contractor's cargo guys had to take off before the cranes could fully disassemble, so I wasn't able to get a full group photo of everybody all in one spot. But got some nice photos for them, which I sent their way. And then after the cranes were done breaking down, this was not even close to all of the crane guys. I think a lot of the flatbed truck drivers had already hit the road at this point, but these two guys here were the crane operators. That was their spotter right there. And the rest of the guys would have been their certified riggers. And then you've got Colin Atwood and Jim Baker right there in the mix.
What the heck they doing there? They're in the way, aren't they?
Wanted to show that it was a collaborative effort.
I love how Colin and Jim are like right in the front, like they did it.
No, they just said, we got it from here, guys.
Yeah, and then I hopped inside there just so I could prove that I was there. So that was it. The cranes packed up and hit the road. And the first thing that the crew did was they moved 2103 off the house track. It had been right up there. They moved it over to the main track here. Then they moved that string of freight cars that had been on the passing track back over to the house track here. And the locomotive, they were using 3873. They had been on this end here to get all those moves done. So they had to run around on the main track there. And that was definitely a very cathartic moment for me, because I was just alone there for about 5 or 10 minutes with the locomotive and just got a couple pictures of it sitting there. And that was just incredible. 4.5 years had led up to that point right there.
An emotional too.
Very much so.
So from the house track, did it go west to get back on the main line?
Yes.
It had come off the house track behind where this photo was taken. The house track is the track in the foreground. So it was brought down to the switch onto the main track down there and then shoved up
Yeah,
past the
that's
two
on the west,
switches.
yeah, okay,
down
that makes
that way.
sense.
There's the unabridged video that I shot of when it was pulled up to the yard.
Who's driving?
Who's in the cab?
I think
Smile on his face.
Shane Neal was the engineer on that one. But yeah, Colin was pretty happy riding. The thing on the video. And there it was parked up on track 1 next to the exhibit hall. Shot of it from across the valley there. And that's it for the photos.
Yay.
So just a quick epilogue here for the last couple slides I had put together, which I didn't actually end up finishing. So the weekend after it got up there, we did the first tests on the locomotive. We powered on the electrical systems. We hooked 3873 back up to it and laced up all the multiple unit connections. We found an MU jumper cable. First time in my time at the museum, we'd ever MU'd a piece of, or two locomotives together. So that was interesting by itself. We had to figure out a couple issues with why 2103 wasn't passing control through. And it turned out that there is a control key in the cab, which had been left in the off position, which cut all the controls out on it. So after going through the schematics, which we had gotten from NCTD, I found which switch was the offender and hot wired it.
Oh, without a key.
Yeah, without a key. We did finally get a key for it, so I've just got it permanently in on position now. And also, we hadn't realized somebody had pressed the emergency MU shutdown button in the cab. I guess that one was a pull-out button, but it was all lit up red and no one had really registered like, that button's lit up red right now. So every time we plugged in the MU cable between the locomotives, 3873 would die. And we're trying to figure out, like, what's wrong with this stupid thing? Why does it keep killing it? And then we realized, oh, duh, shutting the engine down like it's designed to. But once we had that figured out, we took it out on the main track. We did a couple back and forth runs with it. There's a couple videos floating around on YouTube that you can find if you look hard enough of that first day that we were testing it. I mentioned earlier that the horn was stolen off of it when it was in Anaheim. A couple of our guys, as well as a couple guys from Southern California Railway Museum, picked up a horn that we had sitting on the shelf that was just gathering dust. They tore it apart completely, put all new rubber and diaphragms in it. So they got a good horn for it. The first time we actually sent it out on a train was during the 2022 North Pole Limited season. And that was, we didn't publicize that at all. That was just a, let's put this thing on a train and see how it handles. And it was totally fine. So in February of 2023, we did a really thorough wash on the locomotive, trying to scrub all that road grime off of it. I think Jen, you, Carl,
Gabe and Rourke.
Gabe and Rourke spent an entire 8-hour day working on it.
That was much longer than that because we had to clean it by hand with Brillo pads.
Yeah.
Because it was so caked on there that the power washer wasn't working, the mops weren't working, so we got those like green, like those big green scrubby pads and literally just scrubbed it by hand. And I got to climb on top and do like clean all the top part off and not down, so it's fun.
Yeah, I pitched in for only about an hour at the end of that. I think I managed to get the main reservoir tanks, at least the ends that faced towards where people board the train, I got those cleaned off. So the rest of the tanks look totally grimy and disgusting, but at least they look clean on the face that faces everybody. And we did our first publicized inaugural run day, what was it, about February 15th of last year, give or take. And it was great. Perfect weather, great turnout. I did a little 10-minute talk in front of the locomotive to anybody who showed up and wanted to hear about it. We gave tours through the locomotive. A good time was had by all. Last really noteworthy things that we've been doing ever since then have just been some minor electrical work on it. The locomotive did come to us with a couple quirks. One of those is that it was designed originally for the horn to have a half tone and a full volume tone. And it had been rewired at some point, so moving the lever both ways gave you full volume. So that took a little bit of diagnosis. It ended up just being a couple wires and a capacitor that had to get swapped around. So that, or it was at a diode, so the current would only pass one way if you had it on the half tone, but you could pass through both ways on full tone, if that makes any sense. We also had to fix the sander control. For some reason, they had just miswired it at the shop there. So the wire from the sander control to the next terminal block to go to the computer, it was on the wrong terminal block. So it just didn't have sand for the last however long it was running around. And nobody at NCTD had ever complained like, hey, how come the sanders don't work on that thing?
But do you need Sanders in San Diego?
You do?
Yeah.
Yeah, for a slippery day when it's rainy.
I guess that.
The engineer was doing his full
calendar day
checkup.
inspection, did they?
Yeah.
I guess not.
They have to do, they have to be working.
Yeah,
We gotta do that.
I don't know. I'm just telling you how it arrived to us. We did a series of training sessions for our engineer roster last year, just to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to run the locomotive so that they not only knew how to run it, but also how to go through the process of MUing it with another locomotive. And that more or less brings us to where we are today. We've got a locomotive that the engines don't run on, but we can push it around and use it to control another locomotive as much as we want. So what does the future hold for us? Well, after this whole adventure here, the one really lasting thing that we have to remind us of all the back and forth that we went through to make this happen was we still have that CARB requirement hanging over our head. If the locomotive is brought back into service, it has to be repowered to EPA Tier 4 or cleaner standards. What the future holds as far as the regulatory environment in the state of California is anybody's guess. We can attempt to plead our case legally that as a museum, we really shouldn't be bound by that kind of regulation. We could plead our case that one locomotive being operated a few times a month is not substantially increasing the amount of pollution in the state of California. We could argue that we're already operating older, dirtier, more polluting locomotives every weekend. Maybe that's not something I want to bring to CARB's attention. But that's where we're at now. I would say, unless there is a diametric change in CARB's authority to regulate locomotive emissions in the state of California, I don't see any near-term changes to the status of the locomotive.
Well, could that hole actually be fixed that was cut in?
Yes,
Oh.
EMD engines are made of steel weldments. They are designed for the engine to be able to throw a piston out the side of the block, and you can still weld it and patch it up and make it run again.
Wow.
So,
You just have to block off the hole for the air box, that's all you have to do.
exactly.
Gee.
I mean, realistically, the only damage you could do to an EMD engine that makes it so uneconomical that you couldn't fix it without just a complete rebuild would be if you torched the crankshaft in half.
Hmm.
I can't think of any other damage you could do to it, either through some combination of cutting or removing parts that couldn't be reversed. Because they're built with power assemblies. They have a head, a liner, and a piston that are one removable unit. So you can, even if you blow up, you crack a piston, you bend a connecting rod, you throw a rod out the block, you pinhole a liner, all of that stuff is just unitized so you can replace it.
Yeah, got it.
You lift it out, and drop it, or
You know, excuse me, go ahead, Jim.
I just think it's funny that we shove it around with a locomotive that puts out more pollution than that could ever put.
I know, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's where we're at right now. It's not a technical question of getting it up
Oh,
and
yeah,
running.
exactly.
It's a regulatory question.
You mentioned also use the EMD, but I thought EMD was out of business.
They are, but they're so prolific throughout the world that there is a massive aftermarket parts market for EMD parts. And especially for an EMD 645 bed like these locomotives have, I imagine there will be a healthy part supply for these for at least the next 30 to 50 years.
But when this thing was built new, it had EMD engine. It was EMD still in business in 95?
It was.
Okay.
So EMD, it never ceased to exist. EMD was a division of General Motors.
Right.
They sold that division to Caterpillar.
Oh.
So Caterpillar owns the EMD brand. They still provide some support in-house actually to the EMD 645 line of engines, as well as the 710. But as far as new products, they've really moved on to a Caterpillar-based locomotive system. Because the EMD products are not Tier 4 compliant without pretty heavy exhaust modifications.
Oh, so I didn't know this. So you could buy a locomotive from Caterpillar.
Yes,
I did not know.
yep, Progress Rail, that's the division name.
Okay.
And just a footnote, it's interesting because a lot of the locomotive parts were EMD parts. Morrison Knudsen went belly up a few years after these locomotives were built. Their assets were acquired by Motive Power Inc., which was another independent, at the time, locomotive manufacturer, who in turn has been gobbled up by Wabtec, who is the competitor to Caterpillar Progress Rail. So kind of funny how that works out. The true successor of the builder of the locomotives is the competitor to the supplier of most of their mechanical parts.
Well, the other thing you mentioned, like, I probably get the acronym right, you called it a marker number or marker letter?
Reporting marks.
Yeah, what are these reporting marks? What is it? What is the
Every-
concept behind that?
Every piece of rail equipment in the United States has reporting marks, which are 2 to 4 letters and a number. So for instance, of the locomotives we operate, 3873 that you see rolling around every weekend, it's a Southern Pacific engine. I say that in quotes. It was
Right.
originally from Cottonville, but it's painted as a Southern Pacific engine.
Right.
So the reporting marks are SP and the locomotive number is 3873. 2103, its reporting marks, because it was part of the San Diego Northern Railway, are SDNX, and the locomotive is 2103. The video of the BNSF train you saw earlier, the lead unit was BNSF 799. BNSF is the reporting marks, 799 is the locomotive number.
So the recording, is that the word you use?
Reporting.
Pardon?
Reporting marks.
Reporting marks. And no more than 4 letters. So most of them are, BNSF, I would recognize that
Yeah,
right off the top.
and if you see a contemporary freight train go by, the cars are owned by all kinds of leasing companies and railroads. So you'll see BNSF, UP, CSXT, NS, GATX, UTLX. These are all abbreviations of the company name of whoever owns that equipment.
And every container's got a reporting mark too.
Yep, UPS or UPSZ, for instance. I think I went through all the footnotes, right? I guess, so we'll talk about the final cost of the move. The trucking and cranes and highway escorts and everything that went into that, plus the BNSF move, which itself was only about $2,500. The total cost for all of this came out to $140,000. So before I open it up for questions here, would I go through and do this process again the way I did it? No. If I had known that it would have happened the way it did end up happening, if NCTD had given any leeway back in 2020 or 2019, for us to take just one of the locomotives at the time, I would have said, we're only interested in one, and we're just gonna truck it out to Campo right now and be done with it. But hindsight is 20/20, as they say.
But you sold some of them for 35,000.
We did make money off.
Did Southern California sell, but they buy, that guy donated some money for that
Yeah.
too, right?
35,000.
He donated 35,000,
Yeah,
so you recovered 70 of the 140?
yeah. So it wasn't a complete money in the hole exercise for us. And we have several lasting benefits too. We now have 2 more bridges that are in service than we had previously. We now have a much better handle on what it's actually going to take to reopen Tunnel 3. It's still very much important that we have that connection to the outside world, because having just gone through this exercise, we now know just how much work it is to really get something that we have a fleeting chance at getting and getting it out to Campo by truck. It's just not sustainable for us to continue acquiring equipment like that. So,
But that might be a good thing,
well,
because a lot of museums have acquired a lot of
Oh,
equipment
it's
that they don't
very
really
sweet,
need.
but I keep telling you.
so that's really all I have to say. I'm many years older for having done this, much wiser. Previously, before this whole exercise, I was a lot more enthusiastic to acquire more equipment for the museum. At this point now, anyone coming to me with a suggestion is gonna get a pretty hard upfront no. Unless they're gonna pump up that kind of money. So now you know where I'm coming from. You've been through the whole story. Sorry for keeping you here for 3 hours. What do you got?
Work on what we have, restore 2353.
Yes, yeah, I'm very much focused on what we own currently.
I don't know, the $300,000 to clear that tunnel, that doesn't sound like an enormous amount, I mean.
It's not insurmountable,
Correct, yeah.
but where the museum was at, especially with where COVID had us in 2021, that was just way too much of a
No, I
stretch for
understand,
us.
yeah, because that's more than the track work we just said.
Mhm.
How many trips to Ducati would it take to recover that amount?
300.
Wasn't that $1 million question?
So
I
Bryce
don't-
asks online, how many miles are on 2103?
So it is actually possible to tell you because it has a computer inside that logs that. I think that the computer registers about 1.5 million miles on it. Yeah,
Low mileage.
41 miles.
yeah, just think of this, and they operated for 26 years, from 95 until 2021. So that's a lot of 41-mile trips back and forth. Any other online questions?
There were a couple, but I answered them.
Okay.
Well, I'm also curious, so when they're lifting all these utility lines, so the people running this operation do it, this SDG, they don't come out and do it, they let these guys do it.
Yeah,
Then they get the traffic.
a lot of these are low voltage and telephone and comm cables. We're not talking about like high voltage.
Right, but I was just thinking, just in terms of that the owners of those cables might be concerned about them breaking.
There's always flex in,
Yeah,
but it really, if they got the situation where it was a high voltage thing or whatever, the utility company would come out.
Well, yeah, no, but I wasn't thinking so much of the high voltage as a matter of just, are they gonna damage this thing when they lift it?
Mark, it's National City, they don't give a shit down there. Cable goes up all the time.
any other questions?
Now, does this 2105 going to Orange Empire, does that help smooth our relationship with them at all? I know it's
I
kind of
think-
rocky there for a while.
I think it did do quite a bit to restore our relationship with them. I think that we have more work to do in that area in terms of getting FaceTime with their people
We want that combine car.
and that's the unpopular question to ask them.
I remember that. Been a long time, but that
What
popped
do we
right
got
up.
for trade?
Yeah, but yeah, my focus really on the relationship with them right now is to be supportive, especially because we have most of the paperwork on the locomotives now. I want to be in a position where if they need anything, they can come to us and we can help them.
And did you imply, didn't quite catch it? Are they also isolated, so they had to put it to track to get that locomotive there?
They are, their railroad connection was severed in, I want to say around 2015. When Metrolink extended their operations down, that's the old San Jacinto branch that BNSF serves going out. They don't actually go all the way to San Jacinto more. They just make it to one lumber yard east of the 215 freeway there. But prior to Metrolink coming through, it was just local freight operations through there. But when Metrolink came through, you know, they have to have a PTC compliant, signalized, centralized traffic control railroad with power operated switches and derails from every industrial track connecting in. So the easiest thing for them to do at the time was just to cut the track connection. And that organization has been working ever since to get that reestablished.
I don't know how they could have got away with removing it and not putting it in. I don't understand. That's not my problem, but
Yeah,
I don't understand.
I feel bad for them. Honestly, they really got the short end of the stick with how that.
They got this track going right by, right?
Yeah.
Like it's right there.
I know, it's not like us where we've got a collapsed tunnel separating us. I mean, they're this close. It's
Stand here and watch Metrolink go right by them.
Yeah.
it's not even the switch, the new switch is put in. It's just from the switch to where their track
Oh, the
ends.
switch is actually
The
put in.
switch is in. It's 400 feet of track that they're missing, or some tiny piece of track.
Well, and they can't put it in because they have to put their regulations or something.
They're just, it's all the regulatory hurdles they have to
Right.
clear. And
It's
policies.
terrible. It's good for.
We'll also use this term hospital,
It's too much,
hospital
so,
track.
but it
Where-
makes
what's
me
the
feel
origin?
Oh, hospital move. So hospital move is where you move railroad equipment that's not a revenue move. It could either refer to you're moving derelict equipment that has either partially or non-functional brakes.
Everything on.
And or you're moving over a section of track in a one-time move to get equipment in or out of a particular spot.
Yeah, just like.
Hospital.
Ideas of how.
Yeah.
Things should look,
I'll remember that term. That's the right term.
but it's very much.
Any other questions? All right, well, I really appreciate everybody's attention tonight. Thank you so much for being here. I hope to see some of you out at Campo.
Before everyone takes off, we have an added bonus for everybody who showed up in person. We're going to do a giveaway for the coaster book, and you can get it signed by yours truly, Stephen Hager right here. So I just did a random number draw from everybody who signed in. And so the winner of this awesome book is going to be Bill. Bill, you are the winner today.
Which Bill?
Bill Hohenhorst.
He left.
I believe.
So he left. Pick another name.
Okay, well,
He
it's
didn't
nothing.
he didn't just stick it out.
Okay, no, he's snooze, you lose. We'll pick a new one.
I'll see you, Jim.
Bob, you could be the winner. Hold on.
Yeah, hold on, 1 second.
Well, anyway.
All right. Bruce, you're the winner.
Ooh.
Yeah, ever seen a book before?
And if anybody wants to sign up for Campo Days to volunteer or to purchase tickets for tomorrow's train ride, I can help you with those things.
All right, thank you, Jen.
Right on.
For everybody who's been listening this whole time, thank you so much. Have a great night.
So I don't know if you remember, it's the new layout. So I'm going to make